Hey, group of leaders, I'm back for another session for our First Thessalonians series. We're in chapter 5, verses 12 through 22. We just left off talking about the day of the Lord, and then it kind of gets back down to earth, no pun intended there, of really Paul addressing some of the things that the church should be doing right now and should be true of every believer individually as well. I do want to just highlight that there's 14 commands in here that Paul gives, but he's giving them in a way of like encouraging and urging the people of Thessalonica to continue doing those things. A couple different circumstances why that we can possibly deduce is that we've talked about before. Their worry and anxiety over some of their brothers and sisters of Christ that have already died. Questions about the second coming, which can always bring about anxiety and worry. Um, and then the surrounding culture of sexual immorality. You've got also the impact of persecution that I'm sure has made some of them discouraged and weak, which is very much evident in this text this week that we see. And so, a couple things I want you to highlight and just kind of look over is first thing you're going to see in verses 12 through 13, you're going to see basically this highlighting of Paul saying, hey, you need to appreciate and regard your elders and pastors and people who are leading over you, laboring in their work, which obviously, when I hear that, I'm like, yeah, that's awesome, but also it tells a lot about the character of the leader too, because it uses words like they're continuing to labor, they're continuing to lead in the word, they're continuing to instruct. So it's not just they're haphazardly doing it. It's something we see like great work being done, and that's my hope for myself. But more importantly for me for this week, I will highlight pastors and elders and how they can encourage them. But I also want them to encourage you because you're leading and laboring and instructing them in ways that I'm not, and I think that's totally okay, and I think that's great. And so we can encourage each other to do that, and it affects not just the leaders themselves, but it affects our unity as a student ministry and as a church. Because then the next part it says peace. Basically it's a command of you are to be at peace. Well, I'll tell you what, part of the greatest things of being a pastor is knowing that your people are at peace. Now, is there going to be problems? Absolutely. But the pursuit of peace should always be something modeled and something we should pursue. So not only is it building up our leaders, but the devotion to our community, which is our community of believers. And you'll see it with the phrasing of among yourselves, with everyone to anyone, one another and for all. It's definitely a collective sense that's being brought forth in this text. And then I kind of give you a helpful thing of thinking about it as a sandwich. You got peace and patience, and then basically how can those be provided and sandwiched for those who procrastinate, that need comfort that's provided, and then those who need to be propped up. Basically, kind of like this whole part of there's people that are lagging in their work, possibly lowly in spirit and limping in their faith, and every single one of those types of people need the care they need for the church to see to it, as it talks about in this passage. So this will be a very encouraging time, but it can also be very convicting because, for those who are weak and who are needing comfort, or those who have procrastinated, not doing the things that God's called them to do, where the Lord's calling them to be faithful, you know, that's for the encourager, but it's also for the one being encouraged. Like, hey, we need to hear that. We need to hear that in our own lives. And then finally, I'll give you this is the at the end of it, it says, basically pursue what is good and then push away evil. Well, then that's repeated again when talking about our response to the words given that we hear from people who claim to be in the Spirit. I do find it interesting. He says he gives some response for devotion to please God, of praise, praying, and professing gratitude. All those things are commanded. So regardless of circumstances, we're to do those. But I find it very interesting. Prayer is used in the middle tense or the middle voice, I believe. And if it's in the middle voice, that means it's for the benefit of the recipient and the benefit of the giver. So when we pray, it's not just us, it's a benefit to us praying, but it's also a benefit to others as well. We're praying for one another, so that we can be spiritually built up, and that can increase our gratitude, and that can also increase our praise of the Lord. But one of the basic ways that does that is our intimacy with pleasing God in our connection with His Word, and being open to the prophetic ministry of the church, and really the prophetic ministry of people who share share the gospel, share the testimonies of faith. We are not to extinguish that. We're not to be like a fire hose and just automatically extinguish that. I know that's tough because we're so used to hearing false stories, or you always hear the term fake news. Well, that's nothing new. When it concerns churches, we hear churches developing fake news instead of the good news. But we can still be, what my professor once said, open but cautious. And I think that's a good test. And that's exactly what it's talking about, is testing, evaluating. Is that person sharing the gospel? Are we hearing the gospel? And then really evaluating if we are listening to preaching of the gospel, and then really, are we preaching the gospel? I think that's important too for us is, for instance, if a student's going to school and someone's proclaiming a truth about God, or a supposed truth about God, test it. Test to see if it's actually rooted in the Word. That's how we know. How do we know if it's according with the Spirit? It's got to be accordance with His Word. That has to be the consistency. And sometimes I'm going to use the illustration this Sunday. It's like cracking an egg. It's very easy to distinguish that, because it gives this thing of like holding on to what is good but passing up evil. Sometimes it's like a walnut shell or a peanut shell or a pecan shell. Those are a little bit tougher to crack, but you still can distinguish what's good and what's not. You're not going to eat the shell. You're going to eat what's inside the shell. That's good. But man, taking apart an oyster shell is a whole different story. I mean, you got to have tools. You got to have gloves on. Even with shrimp and tearing that apart, it seems like that's just such a tedious task. But that's what God calls us to do. He calls us to examine what is being said and from the person, and see, is it good or is it evil? Is it going to help me pursue good and help me pursue what God called me to do, or is it going to be me falling into embracing evil? And that's the thing that Paul is just saying, hey, if you want this peace within your community and you want this to be true of your life, then make sure that you follow these instructions and obey them. Not because Paul said them, because Paul says earlier, these are words from God. So I hope you take this in and use it for this week, and I hope it's helpful for 1 Thessalonians 5, 12 through 22.